Thank you all for joining us for the SICSS-Africa and African Descendants Inaugural Panel, Interrogating Data Collection Methods Focused on African and African Descendants, Challenges and Opportunities. This panel represents our first foray into planning across 4 SICSS sites: SICSS-West Central Africa and Cameroon, SICSS-Covenant in Nigeria, SICSS-JIAS IPATC in South Africa, and SICSS-Howard Mathematica in the United States. It is my pleasure to introduce my student, colleague, and friend, Susanna Ejong, who will introduce this groundbreaking multi-site SICSS panel. First, her bio. Susanna Ejong is a global development, humanitarian, and peace and security consultant with over 15 years of experience in multilateral civil society and government organizations on 3 continents. She is co-founder of Collateral Benefits, a storytelling platform that documents perspectives from Africans and Afro-descendants about transcending COVID-19, a founding member of African diaspora platforms such as Afro-Innova, Colombia, and Africa 2.0, Spain, and a member of the advisory board of the Collective for the Renewal of Africa, Senegal. From Equatorial Guinea and Spain, Susanna studied at the Complutense University in Madrid, the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, is a 2014 Yale World Fellow and a 2022 Harvard MPA Mason Fellow. It is my honor to introduce Susanna.
Thank you so much, Nanette. It's so amazing to be here today with you and everyone around the room to talk about this important issue. The title of this panel is Interrogating Data Collection Methods Focused on African and Afro-Descendants, Challenges and Opportunities. And it's so relevant today. We all want to find solutions to the problems of today and the problems of the future. And for that, data must be reliable and of high quality. The reality is that there are a lot of problems with data. The data validity of problems pose significant bottlenecks for creating the right theoretical insights into the complex issues that are peculiar to the people of Africa and the people of the African diaspora. Previous attempts at circumventing data challenges in Africa have relied on surveys, estimates, or models that often do not reflect the reality of many African countries and communities. In order to have a robust discussion, we have to ask ourselves difficult questions. Questions such as, what challenges exist in the collection of precise data? How do these challenges affect how poverty indices and reports are generated? What can stakeholders do to improve data quality? What unique tools are available to collect more precise data that includes the perspectives of the communities studied? This panel will discuss these key challenges in the collection of precise data, as well as how these challenges influence how African and people of the African diaspora are studied and economic indices are generated. The panelists will draw from the unique expertise and experiences working with different forms of data to critically reflect and challenge current data collection methods while highlighting innovations and new strategies to collect data about people of African and African descent. Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us for our Africa and African Descendants panel discussion with Lebogang Ramafoko. My name is Nanette Coleman, and I am the organizer from the SICSS-Howard Mathematica site in the United States. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Lebogang Ramafoko. I will close with a few resources for you to get to know our 6 sites that organize this groundbreaking event: SICSS-West Central Africa in Cameroon, SICSS-Covenant in Nigeria, SICSS-JIAS IPATC in South Africa, and my site, SICSS-Howard Mathematica in the United States. Our speaker. Lebogang is currently the executive director of Oxfam South Africa. She is an outspoken feminist, thinker, and strategist. A sought-after speaker, facilitator, and trainer who is passionate about social justice, particularly for young women and girls. Lebo combines her own life experience as a Black woman who grew up in apartheid South Africa, thrust into activism at an early age, and the skills she acquired through her training to speak out against injustice wherever she goes. She's one of the prominent media commentators and advocates on various social issues facing women in South Africa. I'm so incredibly proud to call her my Harvard Kennedy School classmate, colleague, and friend. Welcome, Lebogang. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for having me. It is such an honor to be speaking at this forum. When I was asked to contribute to this forum, I thought firstly about who I am and the community that I come from, and how, as a Black South African woman, the way in which data is collected, who collects the data, which data is valued and which one is not, has really influenced my thinking about data. Now, for starters, there is no question in my mind that data-based decision-making is key. If we wanted to provide housing, if we wanted to provide healthcare, if we wanted to know how many vaccines for COVID we need to procure and provide, this information must be driven by data. But I come to you firstly, and I'm going to reintroduce myself. I am a Black middle-class South African identifying as a woman. I have the privilege of an education that enabled me to study abroad, and I hold a position of power as the executive director of Oxfam. So firstly, I want to acknowledge that I stand on the shoulders of many, both from my lineage, who due to the legacy of apartheid, any career other than fetchers of water was illegal in this country. I position myself in this way because, in fact, I have interacted firstly in spaces where I felt that I am a subject of study rather than a contributor and an equal to the collection of this data. I speak to you 28 years later, and we are heralded as the most unequal society in the world. And if you couple that with corruption and an overall state failure, you are finding that many other people are not able to get the education that was afforded to me. We are sitting in South Africa, where those who are able to complete just their high school education are less than 50% of those who entered school with them. And to date, we do not have strategies, nor do we have answers of what happens to those who do not complete schooling. To make the picture even more bleak, for those who complete schooling, a number of them do not have the necessary resources to pursue education elsewhere. For those who are able to get into universities, a number of them are not able to pursue any qualification in the STEM field, in data analytics, to a point where up to today, when we go to conferences, we are the subject of studies and not the creator of studies. So the first challenge, as you have heard from me, is to, before we even speak about data, we actually need to ask ourselves who collects the data and whose data is it? I have spent many years in the HIV and AIDS field, a pandemic that still mainly affects young women between the ages of 15 and 24 in sub-Saharan Africa. I have sat in many fora where many scholars, many researchers, A+ researchers have spoken about the various studies that they have done. The first thing that has really concerned me is who is the subject of the study. While I hold a position of privilege, I have not been able to extract myself from the reality that the bodies and the lives that are mainly studied are the bodies and the lives of poor Black South African women who, for starters, in their own relationships do not have agency. And despite the many, many studies that they have participated in, do not own any of that information that they have helped many, many researchers to gather. While I understand, and I am not lost to why it is important to study, to why it is important to conduct these studies, I do not leave those centers of research, no matter what ethics codes have been obtained, with a clear conscience that what I do is mainly collecting data that will save lives. Because for me, any woman who shares stories about the violence that they experience in their lives, any woman who shares the story about their poverty, any woman who shares a story of how they are not able to take ARVs because in their relationships, they will be accused of bringing HIV. For me, I look at a part of my story. And if it is not a part of my story, it is a part of a story of either a sister, a cousin, a neighbor, a friend that I know. And therefore, this position of privilege and the spaces that I have been in, while for the researchers who do not have the same lived experience that I have, marvel at the findings that are coming out, the findings of voluntary male circumcisions that come out. I am worried about the lives of the women that could be me, that are my sisters and my cousins. And therefore, for me, science is very personal, and I cannot be neutral and only look at the value of the studies that we extract. I watch women sign up month after month, study after study, to be able to earn a stipend in the studies that they collect. They do not know that if they get an intervention, whether it's a placebo or is the real thing, because that is the rigor of studies that will help us get the data that we need. And for each woman that I look at a woman who is going to give us so much, and yet they do not have agency in their lives. And for many of them, it is poverty that brings them to these studies because of the incentives that they have. So for me, the issue of data is not only about how do we get the numbers, what technologies do we employ in getting the data that we get, is at what cost and on whose bodies. Black women have contributed so much to a science that they do not own. They do not come into universities to become professors. Theirs is information and data that serve for the advancement of others, including leaders like myself who rely on that data to make decisions. The other challenge I want to talk about is which data and which science is valued. I'll draw again from my experience in the HIV field, where for a number of times when we argued around the drivers of the epidemic, the social, political, economic drivers of the epidemic, we stood alongside scientists, researchers who said the solution is treatment. And in that era, we created a dichotomy and we spoke about the power relation that exists where data is concerned. So qualitative data, when you sit under a tree in a community steeped in oral culture, and you understood what goes on in the lives of many women, what goes on in the lives of women who are making life and death decisions about their own sexuality. How funding, speaking about the unequal power relations of which data is valued, had been skewed towards the science that counts, the science that have randomized controlled trials, the science that was applied in laboratories, when in fact, in South Africa and in Southern Africa, we know that HIV is not only a health issue, but a socio-economic and political issue. And we sit as a country, and yes, many women, and rightly so, advocated for the provision of life-saving antiretroviral treatment. And today, we do know that HIV has become a chronic illness when people test and are initiated in treatment. And after many struggles in South Africa, where many unnamed men and women died unnecessarily when drugs were available, we understand that that intervention was necessary. But did it really have to come at a cost of de-investing from social scientists who relied on qualitative data, who went into communities and listened to stories, who understood how the power relations that are driven by patriarchy, by white supremacy, by capitalism have put women in the position that they are in? And again, as a privileged Black heterosexual woman, I have watched and admitted and seen what the value of advocating for life-saving treatment has been. But I have not gone home without understanding and being uncomfortable about what it means when you are not addressing the socio-economic and political space that women find themselves in. While activists around HIV marched and made sure that we remove patents, it was such a shocker when COVID hit that many other countries still had to go out in the streets and basically advocate that we do not have patents on the vaccines, and how rich countries still hoarded the vaccines, even when data suggested that, in fact, when we spread the vaccines across the world, we, everywhere in the world, corporately, will survive this pandemic. But we have seen that when data is used and it supports the powers that are essentially not in the global south, and they are not going to be the initial beneficiaries, but drugs are going to be brought to Africa and at a profit, that data is supported. But when the same data says to the international world, it says to the global north, let us share the vaccines, let us make sure that everybody is vaccinated, including countries in sub-Saharan Africa, countries in the global south. We have seen how that very data that we have been told to follow, that we have been told to take on, is not used to our benefit. So I think for me, when we speak about data, these are some of the realities that we are going to have to contend with. Now, I want to come back to qualitative data, especially the decision-making that we make using data that excludes communities that are steeped in oral history. We had, when I was still the executive director, and at that time, in fact, I was the senior executive for media at Soul City, an NGO recognized in the world for developing television soap operas that dealt with many social issues in South Africa. That was a popular soap opera, although it carried health messages, and that was viewed by 7 million adults above the ages of 16 in South Africa. It became a household name. Despite that success, despite that data, if we are talking about data, we all had to struggle around whether or not investing in the Soul City television dramas was a worthwhile investment when you could take that money and invest in drugs. And we were always asked and had to be at pains to show numbers and show causality around behaviors that were changing as a result of watching the Soul City television series. Now, two issues are very, very interested because they raise one issue for me around data that I also think that it's important for us to focus on. Firstly, is which research and which data gets invested in. Now, I know that if an A+ researcher and scientist came and wanted to go into a poor Black community and wanted to know whether or not medical circumcision is going to reduce the risk of HIV transmission, they will get lots and lots of money. It will go to ethical standards, it will pass ethical standards, and then they will be able to go and do what I call their experiments on the lives of Black men. I'm not disputing the fact that that information is important. I'm not disputing the fact that the result of that information has helped us as countries develop policies and make decisions around expenditure, around which methods are we going to advance and support and give funding to, and which methods are we not going to. I absolutely understand the value of that. However, 3 communities in South Africa named themselves Soul City. 3 communities identifying very strongly with the stories and the lives of the people in the fictional world that demonstrated the nuanced way in which people make decisions via story, named their communities Soul City. We went around and in one instance captured a shack, which is a tin house, an informal structure in South Africa that many, many poor people live in, which was titled 513 Soul City. The question then arises, how do you quantify that? What does that tell you? Because behind any community naming itself after a story that they identify with is a lot of data. That a scientist that employs methodologies like what we have in labs, the randomized control trial, is not going to be able to get. So where does this hierarchy of data and science come from? I have a clue. And my clue is the fact that, firstly, that which is developed in the West is seen very superior, or in the global North, it's seen more superior than that which is developed in the global South. Our lives, our experiences are valuable when what they mean are extracted by mainly researchers that are not our own researchers, but our own science has had very little investment. By the time I left Soul City, part of the grant making, some of them by very powerful US agencies, had really been removed a lot from the social determinants of health and put in biomedical interventions. And the story that we were made to believe is the fact that the science does not back up those interventions that deal with the social and structural barriers of HIV. Now, coupled with the fact that I told you at the beginning, the level of our education and how many people are not able to be data scientists and get into this field where data science is collected. What does it mean of us? I've got 30 years in this field, and today I had to speak yet again about gender-based violence. When in fact, if the science that I brought by sitting with women in community halls, by sitting with women under the trees, by sitting with men in taverns, which are places where they gather to drink, I collected their data, and that data was given the same value that other data around randomized control trials was given, perhaps I would not have been sitting here yet again, more than 30 years of doing this work, still talking about what interventions do we need to curb gender-based violence in South Africa. So I guess I'm giving these examples to basically say this science has got a history and a context that in order for it to be valuable, it needs to recognize some of these uncomfortable truths about it. I do not have the answer about how do you use data to inform decisions around communities that are steeped in oral traditions. But what I know is that when I get into a community and I humble myself and I recognize my positionality in the world, but I actually sit down and I listen, I hear stories that I know data is not giving us. I understand what communities do to build their own resilience. I understand what sense making looks like. For an example, while in South Africa, we purport to be Christians, a religion that also wiped away African spirituality. Almost 80% of Black South Africans will consult with a traditional healer. Where is the science that shows us and begins to understand what it is that makes 80% of South Africans, political leaders, in some instances, even preachers in the church, who will denounce our religions as heathen religions, as backward religions, as primitive religions, will themselves, when they need support, when they need strength, when they need success, when they need breakthrough, they will leave the Bible at home or any other book of faith and go into a hut and go into a back room to go and speak to an African traditional healer. We are sitting in Africa, and still today, we are grappling, even during COVID, around what does this mean and how do we integrate health and the data that comes from that into what we call scientific data. And the only answer that we have right now really is the fact that, well, some of the concoctions that they give people have not been scientifically tested. Therefore, we cannot even advocate for them. I absolutely agree. I also agree that you cannot put people's lives in danger. But the issue is not that it has not been tested. The issue is that the data that we have and the decisions that we make, even in our health interventions in Africa, in a country in Africa, in the southern tips of Africa, is living out a lot of data that emanates from exactly why do people go and see these traditional healers? What is it about going to see those traditional healers that makes sense or that helps individuals make sense of their own lives? Now, if our sciences were equal, I would tell you that when I stand here, and this is something, by the way, that I learned outside of the education that I have had, including at Harvard. And I'll also talk about that, about who trains scientists and where are they trained. But the point I'm making about these examples about traditional healers is the fact that I know and I understand right now that when I stand here, when I call myself Lebogang Ramafoko, when you listen to my praise name in an African language, it recognizes a deep lineage that I come from. A lineage that was disrupted by colonization, by missionaries who came and called our religions and our ways of sense-making and worshiping heathen. A sense-making that connects me to others. So while my privilege and my education enables me to get into a very cold room where I am seen by somebody who's got a science that is foreign to me, who will probably tell me that this is what you need, you've got a virus, you've got this, you've got that, and these are the protocols that you need to follow, and I walk out with that. There is a large part of who I am that is not accommodated in those spaces. And in many instances, the data, the scientific data, the data that we have been sold to say, if you go to a certain doctor, if you go to a certain professional, Western educated professional, they've got the data and the know-how that are going to heal you. They don't speak to who I am fully. And so in my adult years, I have had to go back, not only in my prayers as a Christian, but even in my practice, just as a human being, with all of my privilege, with all of my knowledge, and begin to understand what it means to be a Black woman called Ramafoko. I had an uncle, God bless his soul, who passed away, who whenever we had a family gathering, would come to me and thank me. And the way that he would thank me is he would emphasize what Lebogang means. And my name Lebogang means show gratitude. And, you know, at the beginning, because when you've got education and when you've got positions of power, when you are employed, in fact, in South Africa, let alone, you know, how my own life has advanced, you know, and we know how it happens in African families and in Black families, you are most likely to be, you know, the first graduate. At first, it made me uncomfortable because my issue was he is looking at the financial contribution that I may have made to whatever family function that we had. Until I opened my ears, until I really listened to what he said. And he said to me, we prayed for you to come. And we made promises to our ancestors that everything that she does, we will pray that it is blessed. And when we see it, we will give thanks. And that is what Lebogang means. This happened probably 2 to 3 years before he died. And there is nothing that informs me right now that does not make me go back to my own ancestry and give thanks. Because even beyond my own way of understanding what he really meant, and year after year, particularly since he has passed, I am trying to make sense of what it is that he said. But there is so much that I carry with me right now in my positions of leadership, in my positions of influence, in every space that I am. And I carry one question: what did it mean? What is the promise? What is the covenant that those that came before me entered into when they said, we prayed for her, we asked you to bless her, and we made a promise that whenever we see the fruit of the blessing we asked for, we will give thanks. Now, if I was in the UK, you know, and I was blue-eyed, and I was Harry, or I was William, it would have been a given that I'm born within a certain royalty, and that royalty, although questioned now, I must admit, but it's revered. It's a given. How less royal is what my uncle told me about what my name means. And now, without shouting it on the rooftops, I understand exactly who I am. Not only who I am, but whose shoulders I stand on, but what covenant was entered into. When I made decisions, it's not only the data that science, or what we call science, will give you, and I'm not doubting that it is science. I am recognizing that it is science that excludes the richness of the story that I'm telling you about my uncle. I realized that it would not form the totality of who I am. It would not form the totality of how I made decisions. So what I'm left with, because my life, my existence, my story is not taken into consideration when seats of power are decided upon, I then have to live a schizophrenic life. I've got to exist in this world where if I walked in as the executive director of Oxfam and I speak about ancestors, people will look at me and as if they would not have doubted me as a Black woman, because I have had to prove my worth everywhere that I go, as if they had not already doubted me. It will rubber stamp and cement why I am not worthy of the position that I hold right now. So what choice do I have? I live a schizophrenic world. In my little corner, I understand and I tap into that knowledge told through story. And then in another, I go and I read papers and I read theories and I read data and I use data to inform our lives. Now, wouldn't the world be richer if we all understood the value of this data, rich data that sits in African stories, in African ways of making sense, in African ways of making meaning? Wouldn't I be out there in universities teaching? Because at every universities, you see people from the African diaspora. In many countries, because of the failed state, they leave and they go into different countries and they are completely uprooted from their own places. And yet, the rich knowledge and the richness that we bring in our history, because we've got years and years of that not being recognized as important data, we have not basically developed the tools that will mine the data and make sure that even when we train professionals, they will be able to benefit from the value of that which is data that is done in a classical manner and the data that historically we have not gathered. Now, I am proud that I went to Harvard. In fact, there is a little joke towards the end of the year at Harvard towards graduation, a little YouTube video that says, when do you throw the H word? Where in conversation do you throw the H word? But I wish, and this thought is not an original thought. It is something that was poked within me when I saw a young man who did not want to go and study in Canada, but wanted to go and study in Rwanda. Because until we also value the fact that there is deep knowledge and there is deep expertise in the global South. And I understand, I'm fully understanding of why many of us will go and we will go into universities outside of our own continent. I know how many countries have been at war, how many countries have been unstable. I understand all that. That is not what I'm questioning. And I don't take light the sacrifices that are made by many, many families to send their children, their loved ones to go and study in universities abroad. I was a single mother with 2 children, unemployed when I studied at Harvard. So I understand that privilege. But I think even with that, a question needs to be asked around at what point are we going to elevate scholarship that comes from African universities that is Afrocentric? But just so that we don't lose hope, what gives me a lot of courage It's young women and young people in general, in fact, who are calling for the decolonization of education. While some in South Africa called it violent, but when universities that are in the top 5 or the top 10, and UCT and others, students said, decolonize this curriculum, I knew that we are onto something. Change will not be linear, and we are not going to see it overnight. But I guess the conversation about a decolonial education, even if we do not realize it now, even if we do not realize it in our lifetime, recognizes a very fundamental issue, that unless all data is valued, unless our stories, our oral traditions, investments in qualitative data, the gathering of qualitative data, the tools that will make us collect the stories and understand what they mean, doing it in a respectful manner. Unless we do that, it will be same old, same old. And I think young people, particularly in my country, or younger people, are beginning to tell us that which you throw at us as theory, that which you throw at us as data, we can see the gaps. And we are no longer interested in accepting that that is the real data. So I hope that as scholars, as scientists, as people who use data, who have been trained in one way or the other, begin to ask yourself around which data are we using, who owns that data, how are we collecting it, and how are we excluding a lot of rich data because it is not recognized. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us, Lebogang. I know our participants are looking forward to live Q&A with you and our other panelists during the Institute in June. Thank you for joining us. For more information on the work of 6 sites expressly serving Africans and African descendants, check out each of our websites and resources.